Get started. So next up, we've got a slight change in the program. So rather than me waving my hands up here, we're going to actually have the people who can really help you figure out the next steps of applying anything that you like here to your value streams. And that's Jeff Downs and Mara Puisite, who've worked with some of our largest customers in helping them structure, approach, and really plan out their value stream transformations and how to approach value stream management, whether it's from an integration perspective or a visibility perspective. So Carmen will be assisting as usual, and off we go.
All right, thanks, Mick. So I'm just gonna sort of tee this up here. So, going back to kind of the diagram, right? What we're gonna focus on now is really the kind of that bottom layer of how the tools being connected and the artifacts being connected kind of through that activity model is really helpful in order to get you to start to visualize how things are flowing in that flowing of artifacts, as part of your value stream. So I know when I was at Nationwide, Jeff had came out and we did this value stream architecture exercise, and I actually blew it up on the wall to try to get people to understand that visualization. So I'll talk more about that at the end, but the purpose of this really is, and Dominik has already talked about this, right, is you need to visualize things, right? You need to visualize those communications. You need to visualize problems that occur during handoffs as work flows across a value stream. I mean, we all have value streams, right? It's like Deming would say, there is a process. It's just, are you in control of your process, or is your process in control of you? There is a value stream, but we need to have it visible. And we need to make those connections visible so we can have those conversations. I mean, again, it gets back to giving the information to have the necessary conversations that you need to have in order to improve. And then it's really a good learning experience, right, for how to start to apply this. So as Dominik said at the end of her talk, there was a companion guide that we did. Jeff worked with us on that. That sort of is this value stream canvas exercise. And that's sort of we're making that come to life today in this presentation. So with that, actually, Jeff, I think I was supposed to leave that slide, but I clicked once too many. So.
Keep talking if you want.
No, I'm done.
All right. Press here. All right, I want to start by personally thanking Mick for calling me at 10:30 last night and giving me the opportunity to stand up here and talk today. He told me that I would do 4 slides for 7 minutes. And then this morning, Carmen told me that, why don't you just go ahead and do the whole thing? So being a good boss, I dragged Mara up here with me to help. So she's had less heads up than I had. Can we go back? There we go. So we've had talks kind of at the very highest level, kind of all the way down to the lowest level with Mark and Jeff today. And so what we're going to start to do in this particular talk is bridge that gap between everything you've heard about the flow framework and optimizing flow and eliminating bottlenecks, and how that starts to translate into what Mark's doing, what Jeff's doing at their companies, and getting down into the weeds. And so this is kind of how you start to think about integration and how you can start to promote integration inside of your companies, but also understand how these artifacts are connected and flow. As Carmen mentioned, Dominik talked about making these connections visible. A lot of times when we come in and talk to customers for the first time, Mara and I are both on the pre-sales side, so we get to talk to folks long before they become customers. It's oftentimes the first time that people are in the room together having a conversation about where the work comes from, where the work goes once we're done with it. They really have no idea, and so it always strikes very interesting conversations because it's the first time that these folks are actually talking with one another. I'm just going to build out all the slides because I don't know what happens when I click.
Wait, is the mic on?
It is magic.
Is it on? Is my mic on?
I don't know.
I can be very loud, though. I don't think I need a mic. Can you hear? Okay, see? Okay. Okay, so about people who should be participating in these sessions, and I think that's quite an important part to understand or kind of plan for. I think our answer last time we spoke about this internally with our teams, we said it's important to understand the roles and responsibilities of the people that you're going to be doing this activity with, as well as it's important to sort of understand if you're missing any roles and responsibilities. A good example and a good way to look at it is that it's important to have the people who are actually doing the work. So if you are sticking and doing this with this activity with only tools admins, people who just administer Jira or just administer D&G or some other tool, you might be missing out on some true kind of real life things about the process and real life pieces. So you might be missing some pieces of the bigger picture. Then another thing is about roles and responsibilities that what you can kind of uncover is if you're missing some teams as a whole. For example, just to give you a very real life example, we were recently engaging with kind of 2 different teams with the same customer. And whenever we first talked to them, they said, Jira? Yeah, no, Jira's going away. We're not using Jira. And then when we spoke to the next team, they're like, oh no, we have 20 teams actively using Jira today. So, you just don't assume that people might not know what other teams are doing. So again, roles, responsibilities, and understanding if you're missing any pieces of that puzzle. Now, if you are missing any pieces of that puzzle, don't freak out. This session is sort of a living document that you build up once and you keep building it up and filling in the gaps as you engage with different teams, different roles, even different levels at your organization. You might be starting with maybe a smaller group, smaller development group, and then building up and starting to get different levels of understanding of the bigger picture for this diagram. And then searching, yeah.
Yeah, I think we talked about people that are actually meeting with one another and having this conversation for the first time. You're likely going to have to go out and search for other people to be on the other end of this conversation because people oftentimes don't really truly understand where the work is coming from. We talked to a customer a couple of weeks ago that was convinced they were going to an all Atlassian, all Jira stack, and everything was being done in Jira. By the time we were done with this activity, we had 5 or 6 non-Atlassian tools on the canvas because from their perspective, everything is Jira. But when you start talking to others that are involved, it's really not the case.
Okay, so what we're going to do, Jeff and I will walk through kind of very 2 simple examples and a little more detail to sort of give you an idea of how we kick off these sessions and how we start building out that picture, that diagram that you saw and that you've heard people talk about. So we're going to start with a production incident type of a scenario. So if you don't even know where to start or you're meeting with a certain group and you don't necessarily know like what's a good angle, it's always sort of an easy entry point to talk about production and issues in production. It's an interesting kind of a easy way to open up the conversation. And the easiest sentence that we use is like, what happens when production's down? Or what happens when a customer has an issue and they can't log in or they can't do something with the system? So where do they go? Do they call somebody? Do they email somebody? And that's how you start understanding, kind of building that common language with the team that you're working with to understand how work originates. It is about having good questions. It is all about kind of building good questions and asking good questions to start building that bigger picture. Okay, go to the next slide. So, yep, let's build it out. Let's see the very pretty visuals. Let's go. Okay. So, on to some more specific questions about what you can ask with production issues. So you can start sort of saying, okay, does somebody email it? Does somebody call? Does somebody just like walk up to Joe's desk and tell him that something's down? So how does that happen? And write it down. So as Dominika was explaining, if it's an email, I don't know, draw a little icon. Just make sure you note down how things originate, because understanding the origination, kind of the very original place of something is very important for that bigger picture. Then you can go on and ask, how is this being triaged? How does somebody analyze the production issue? How does somebody decide that a certain production issue needs development attention? So there's a kind of a set of good questions, good probing, leading questions that you can ask for to that team or to the person to start having them understand what you want out of them, essentially, what kind of information you're looking for. Sometimes you might get a little stuck. Sometimes you're kind of, you can't find that common language with a customer or with a team that you're working with. It's also a good idea sometimes to ask sort of leading questions with an assumption or with assumption that you've made. So for instance, if you sort of can't understand how the development service desk communication happened, you can ask something like, well, you said your development is in Jira, right? So how does a developer in Jira see their production issue that they have to work on? Like, how do they find out? And then somebody's going to say, oh, well, actually, all of our incidents get resolved in ServiceNow. And then you're like, well, is there any incidents that need development attention? So you can start understanding where you're, again, finding that common language and making sure that you get the right information. Another thing is make sure that you kind of attack each of these use cases from multiple angles. Production issues, we were just talking about it before when we were planning for this presentation 10 minutes ago, because I was told 20 minutes ago that I'm going to be doing this. So we were talking about the ever so often use case scenario where somebody sends in a production issue and engineering says it's working as designed, so it's a feature request, right? At least we see that a lot at Tasktop. And then it can actually become not a defect or an issue, but a feature request. So make sure to not assume that there's only one path for these items, and keep asking those good questions to get these scenarios out of the person or the team. And then the last thing that I can mention is about good questions is just sometimes make wrong assumptions. Like if you can't get anywhere with a team or with a certain person, make a wrong assumption and just spit it out there and say, oh, so maybe if a incident gets assigned to a certain team, then it flows over to TFS for development's attention. And they will say, well, no, we don't do it that way. So you can make assumptions to have them correct you. Again, just finding a common language to talk through. I think you'll have to click through this.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is just a little scenario where you might have seen a very similar visual in Domenica's presentation where you start with that, okay, how does an issue originate? And then you get to that point where it's in development and it's like a defect, and then you can start going into the next session of like the next set of questions and saying, okay, now when a developer actually has the defect, whenever they want to make some changes, some code changes, where does that happen? Like, do you use Git, GitHub, GitLab? Like you start, again, kind of understanding the next bits and pieces about development. Yeah. And yeah, there you go, Jeff.
All right. So Mara mentioned kind of one area where feature requests come from. There we go. Being the incidents or customers reporting production issues. I was a tester, so I've been told numerous times that this is working as designed. It's not, in fact, a defect. This is a new requirement. You're going to have to submit it over there. So that's one area where these feature requests come from. But there's some additional more common areas. At Tasktop, all of our new feature requests come through Salesforce. So Mara and I and our teammates are taking enhancement requests from folks like you. We log them into Salesforce, and then those flow into the product development team so that they can triage them, break them down, and handle some of those requests. A lot of times we see some of these new business initiatives coming in through a PMO tool like CAPPM or PlanView as an example. So there's a lot of different places where you can start to probe for these types of business features. And click through this one here. A lot of times what we see happen is that these features get created and then there's some sort of triage process or some sort of due diligence that's going to happen. So it's not actually the feature that's going to flow into the it's not actually the new request that's going to flow into the development system. It's going to be more of the feature that's going to flow across after that's been triaged and there we go. All right. So the request becomes the feature, and then that feature heads across to the developers, and then the developers continue to break that down. So again, we're talking about more than one artifact. We're talking about that breakdown as it's happening, and really just starting to lay it out on the canvas here. Ultimately, we're including the testing in this particular area as well, because what we see a lot of times is that, especially with HP ALM, Microfocus ALM, whatever you may be using, we see people that are using this for testing, but there's no requirements in that particular tool. So the traceability that exists between requirement and test case exists somewhere in a spreadsheet, and it's built manually whenever it's needed. So being able to get this request broken down into a feature and the feature to a story and all of that into your test management system gives you that traceability to your test cases, or gives you the ability to build that traceability to your test cases. Anything else on that one?
No, I think the only thing that I actually forgot to add when we were talking through the incidents is going back to asking good questions, and keep asking good questions until you get what you think is the right answer is very important, and especially about originating, where things originate. And a good example that we recently experienced is where we asked about security scans, and we said, we asked like, what happens when you have some vulnerabilities or something along those lines being discovered? Like, how do your developers attend to those? And the answer we got was, well, they just show up in Jira. They originate in Jira. And we said, okay, well, but where do they come from? Well, they just showed up there. I mean, our developers just look at the backlog, and there's the security issues. And then as we asked like about 5-6 more questions, we finally found out that there's Bob, who runs a security scan in White Hat, and then Joe, who exports it manually, and then Mary, who imports it manually into Jira. But for this person that we were talking to, for him, things just showed up. So it's important to understand those little bits and pieces to, again, to just be able to build that bigger picture. Because for them, we very fast uncovered yet another manual step, another break, where there's just potential for issues. That's the one thing I forgot. But I think
so as you start to identify these different sources of work and build them out on the canvas, you start to get a more holistic picture of everything that's going on. These are based on the exercises in the companion guide that Carmen mentioned that's available on the IT Rev website. These are going to be pretty basic self-guided type exercises that any of you all can do on your own. Another thing that we do within our team at Tasktop, and this is something that we're going to do on the very first or second call that we're having with the customer, is start to build out a value stream architecture. So this is going to be guided. It's going to go probably quite a bit deeper than what you would go into with the companion guide exercises that we just talked through. We're going to ask a lot of the same questions. We really want to understand where all of the different types of work comes from, how it's all related to one another, and even as it ties back through the release pipeline at the bottom, we need all of that traceability to exist in order to be able to identify the bottlenecks and optimize the flow across the entire value stream. Another thing that we often talk about as a team is that we don't want to put just the Tasktop integrations on this type of diagram. It's important that you understand all of the integrations that exist between your tools. I know when we worked with this originally with Carmen, we had all of the IBM provided integrations between Urban Code and RTC at the time on the diagram as well, because that was a key part of their value stream. And then to kind of tie this to the flow framework graphic that we've seen throughout the day, we build these value stream architecture diagrams as kind of a single activity, but they're really comprised of 3 different pieces of the flow framework. First of all, the tool network at the bottom. So if you start and you kind of strip off some of the other stuff on the diagram, just down to the tools, you can start to see how each of these tools connects with one another. So we've got Salesforce in the top left connecting to some of our developers that are using VSTS or Azure DevOps or whatever Microsoft is calling it at the time. Also connecting to Jira, because we've got different sets of development teams that are in Jira using the Atlassian suite, and it's not uncommon. We just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago where company had 4 different development stacks that they were using depending on a variety of different factors. So this is establishing the tool network. After that, you're doing integration modeling, and you're starting to kind of layer on what we discussed in that activity that we went through earlier. What are the different models? What are the artifacts that are flowing through the system? So in this case, features from Salesforce need to flow into our 2 agile development tools so that the developers can work on it. Now, once you start talking about the relationship between the tools the developers are using and the tools the testers are using, you've got a lot more artifacts that need to flow. You need to flow both the feature and the story along with the relationships between those. You also need the defect details to be able to come back from the testers to the developers. And once you've done that modeling, what you end up with is your artifact network. And that's what we showed just a moment ago. But that's where we have all of the different tools, the artifacts that exist within those. And even though we were talking about kind of the feature model over here in the previous slide, what we've got now is those features are ultimately a request in Salesforce. Now that we're using Salesforce terminology, they're becoming a feature in VSTS and an epic in Jira. So kind of taking the modeling activity that we did and starting to map it to the actual artifact types that exist within each one of these systems. So, Carmen?
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Mar. So, you know, when we first did this at Nationwide, as Jeff said, I mean, it really started to represent a visualization, right? That even predated, Mick already had the genius for this, but Nealon hadn't convinced him to write the book yet, so we didn't have it on paper. But it allowed us to start to visualize these concepts, right? So if I would say things like, we need to model our value stream, it's like, Carmen, what are you talking about, right? But by taking that previous diagram and blowing it up, right, and hanging it on our wall, and we also did it from a current state and a future state, right? So I kind of had a wish list of integrations, if you will, because it started to get people thinking about, well, look at all these other opportunities we have, right? Or you can see, well, ServiceNow's out here and nothing's connected to it, right? You don't have your incidents becoming defects. You don't have your changes being automatically, flowing from your deployment tool like an Urban Code or Zebia, Excel deploy to ServiceNow or whatever your ITSM tool is. It starts to show you not only what you have, but you can see these islands where there is nobody communicating with them, at least not through these integrations, right? And it gets back into what Dominica said around, how are these communications happening, right? You may have emails, you may have meetings, right? You may have Slack channels, I don't know, but those are things that are wait states in your value stream. Those are opportunities, right? Anything that is going kind of, these are the dirt roads I was kind of talking about, right? They're opportunities to improve, right? And so, by seeing this and making it visual, I know it had a big factor in being able to get people to understand what we were talking about, right? And when you start talking about modeling, now, you're starting to take away some of the tool, making it more agnostic to the tool, right? So yes, we heard talks today, and Jeff related, companies will have multiple agile management systems or defect management systems, or you may be in the process of going from one to another. By having this, looking at the models of the artifacts, it takes that tooling out of the equation, right? Okay, so we're using RTC today, we're using Jira tomorrow. That isn't really going to change the model, right? And I think Mark talked about that today, did a great job, right? So by showing it at the model level, it gives you that abstraction. It shows you the opportunities. It shows you where things are connected. It shows you where things aren't connected, and opportunities to improve. It also gives somebody, that conversation piece to talk about. Sometimes these meetings were the first time all these people got together and talked about the value stream. So if you really are trying to get the flow across your value stream, having a way to have those communications and having people see that common vision is important. You get a lot of those revelations, like, well, gee, I didn't, the story I think Morris said, it just showed up, right? It's like, well, what happens after you're done with this? Well, I don't know, it goes somewhere. I don't know. Where did it come from? Well, I'm not sure, right? I mean, you walk up to sometimes, we had 200 agile teams, and Kristen's going to talk next about some of the great stuff that she's been doing at Nationwide. But when you went to Gemba and you looked at their board, it was great, right? Oh, and Kristen's even extended it further left. But typically it was like, there's the backlog, here's stuff in progress, right? Here's stuff that's done. Well, where did this stuff come from, the backlog? Well, I don't know, it just showed up, right? There's somebody out there with a portfolio, with a spreadsheet probably, right? I mean, there was one person whose job at one point was to walk around to all the agile teams with a piece of paper and write down how many things were in their backlog. And I mean, okay, we get it, but there's a better way to make all these things visible. We need to take advantage of it. So when people heard that, it was like a revelation, right? And it better helps them understand their roles and interactions. When I was evangelizing some of this, once I was talking to folks in an infrastructure area, and I gave my usual spiel, and later the infrastructure VP came by and I asked her how it went, and she said, well, they said it went well, but they didn't understand how it applied to them. And so I said, okay, let's think about this, right? And I'm not blaming them for not understanding, but if there's people in your organization who don't understand how they fit into the value stream, right, that's not a good situation, right? We need people to understand where they fit in delivering value to the business. I mean, if they don't understand it, then it's no wonder the business doesn't understand the value you're delivering, right? If people in IT can't understand how they fit into that. So again, this is one step, right, to doing that. And one that I think is valuable and can lead then to other opportunities, right? Maybe you decide to do a full value stream mapping session, right? But now, even if you did that, you're starting based on some truth, right? These are your tools, these are your artifacts, and if we're using the flow framework and the flow metrics, these are your metrics. So now if you do value stream mapping, you're armed already with a lot more information than you've had in the past, which I used to say sometimes felt like, ifs and buts and wishes, right? Is this really the way things work, or is this the way we wish they worked? Well, now you're getting the reality of how things work in your company. And as I said, this really lays the groundwork, right, for the top part, and that's the chapter that's going to come from Mick and Dominica, which is going to say, okay, once you have connected this, once you have flow of your artifacts, once you start to understand your activities and you understand how they align to a value stream, then what are those metrics you can get out of those? Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is just, because I've had this conversation with customers, is, product can be a scary word, right? It's like, oh, product, I got to implement a product model. That sounds messy. That sounds like an organizational change. That sounds like something I can't get to today or tomorrow, right? And so I understand, right? I've been in those conversations. So ultimately, I believe what Mick's saying is true. To get through the turning point, you have to start to think about this from a product perspective. But your first step here can be an experiment to anything that's going horizontal, right? If you get people to start thinking horizontally, everything has a customer, right? What's your customer? What are you trying to do for that customer, right? And what's being delivered to them, right? And you can go through the 4 flow items, right? The features, the defects, the risks, the debt. But it's easier sometimes to start with what we talked about here, was features and defects. Start thinking about this horizontally, right? If it's a team that's working as horizontal as you can get them, right? If it's an initiative, whatever it is, you can start applying these metrics and these concepts and certainly the model to anything that's going horizontal. So I would not let this idea that, well, gee, I can't start to apply this without doing some grand organization change. That's not true. I mean, ultimately, what you need is to start the journey, right? And the journey is going to start with these experiments, the stories, and those successes that you can then build upon and demonstrate that, this not only gave us value, it can then give value to the rest of the organization. And I think the talk that you're about to hear is kind of like a talk about an experiment like that, and just to show, some of the dividends that occurred with it. So thank you very much.